The bright sun was shining down on the playground, children laughing and playing, completely unaware of the horror about to unfold. My daughter, barely 10, sat in her wheelchair by the swings, her face lit with joy as she enjoyed the fresh air. But that moment of peace was shattered when Karen, the notorious HOA president, approached, her cold gaze fixed on my daughter. "You're blocking the playground," she hissed. Before I could react, Karen pulled out a gun. The unmistakable sound of a shot rang through the air. I froze. Time seemed to slow. I turned, only to find my daughter on the ground, blood spreading around her. But what Karen didn't know, what no one could have guessed, was that this was a mistake she would regret forever. You won't believe what happens next. I never thought I would have to tell a story like this. The kind of tale where you're left speechless, where everything you thought you knew about the world is flipped upside down. My daughter, Emily, is my world. Born with a condition that requires her to use a wheelchair, she's faced more obstacles than any child should. But she's strong, resilient, and her smile can light up the darkest room. For years, Karen had made our lives a living hell. She was the HOA president, the self-appointed guardian of our neighborhood. And to her, anyone who didn't fit her idea of proper was an enemy. But I never expected her to go this far. We had been to the playground countless times before, and never once had we faced any trouble. Until that fateful day. When Karen appeared, I had no idea what she was about to do. I thought maybe she would lecture us, maybe tell us to leave, but I never imagined she would pull out a gun. The shock of the moment left me paralyzed. My heart raced as I rushed to my daughter's side, the blood pooling on the ground, her small body trembling. Karen stood there, her face a mix of satisfaction and disbelief. She had no idea what kind of mistake she had just made. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon, the kind of day when the sun seemed to shine just a little brighter and the air smelled like fresh grass and opportunity. The playground was alive with laughter, children running around, swinging high into the air, and laughing with the joy that only youth can bring. It was the perfect setting, a sanctuary where my daughter, Emily, could finally be like everyone else. Emily had always been my little fighter. Born with a condition that required her to use a wheelchair, she had never let that define who she was. At just 10 years old, she had already faced challenges that most adults couldn't even imagine, but there she was, smiling and laughing with her friends as they played tag. She was content, her face alight with the kind of joy that made me forget, even if just for a moment, about the world outside this bubble of peace. I stood off to the side, watching her with a heart full of pride, as I always did. The other parents around me chatted amongst themselves, their voices blending into a soft hum. But I paid little attention. My focus was entirely on Emily, on the way her friends helped push her around, making sure she wasn't left out, on the way she cheered them on when it was her turn to swing. Everything seemed perfect until I heard the sharp, unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. I turned and saw Karen, the president of the HOA, striding toward us. I knew her well enough by now. She had a reputation in the neighborhood for being controlling, for pushing her agenda, and for always making others feel like they didn't belong. But I didn't expect her to approach us today. We had been living here for years, and while she'd been an annoyance before, she had never crossed the line into outright confrontation. As she walked closer, I felt not form in my stomach. She had that look on her face, eyes narrowed, lips pursed, as if she were about to deliver one of her trademark lectures. I braced myself, knowing that whatever she had to say wouldn't be pleasant. "Excuse me," she called out sharply, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. I looked up at her, surprised by her tone. "Yes, Karen? Is something wrong?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, her gaze lingered on Emily, who was in the middle of laughing with her friends. Then, with a huff, Karen crossed her arms over her chest and finally spoke. "You're blocking the playground," she said, her voice cold and accusing. "This area is meant for children who can actually play. Your daughter's wheelchair is taking up too much space." I blinked, stunned. "Excuse me?" I asked, the shock rendering my voice hoarse. "She's not doing anything wrong. She's just enjoying the playground like everyone else." Karen didn't seem to care. She took a step closer, eyes narrowing as she stared at Emily. I don't care what you think. It's a safety hazard, she insisted. Your daughter's wheelchair doesn't belong here. The playground was built for able-bodied children, not people like her. The words stung, and for a moment I couldn't speak. I felt my blood boiling, but I refused to let her see how much she had affected me. I couldn't let her upset Emily. Not today. Not here. Karen, that's enough, I said firmly, trying to stand my ground. You've crossed the line. But Karen wasn't listening. She had already turned her attention to the other children on the playground, who were now eyeing her warily. I could see the looks of confusion and fear on their faces. Some of them were whispering to each other, their voices hushed but filled with uncertainty. What was this woman doing? Why was she so angry? Your daughter doesn't belong here, Karen continued, her voice getting louder, more insistent. She's in the way. You need to leave. I stepped forward, my voice trembling with the fury I could no longer hold back. We're not going anywhere. My daughter deserves to be here as much as anyone else. But Karen was relentless. She reached into her purse, and I watched in horror as her hand emerged holding a gun. I froze. My heart stopped. The world around me seemed to slow down, the bright colors of the playground now dull and gray as my mind raced to comprehend what was happening. Was this a joke? Was she really holding a gun? But Karen didn't look like she was joking. Her grip tightened around the weapon, and her eyes were cold, filled with something darker than just anger. She wasn't just trying to push us out of the playground, she was trying to intimidate us, to make us fear her. Get away from my daughter. I shouted, stepping in front of Emily, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't afraid for myself, I was afraid for her. But Karen wasn't listening. She took another step forward, her finger slowly moving to the trigger. The air between us felt thick, suffocating. My mind raced. What was I supposed to do? How was I supposed to protect her? And then, just as I was about to lunge forward, the unthinkable happened. The gunshot rang out. It was deafening, a sharp crack that echoed through the playground and sent a wave of terror crashing through me. My body went cold as I looked down, horrified to see Emily crumpled on the ground, blood spreading across the playground floor. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were made of stone, unable to move. But then a surge of panic broke through the paralysis, and I rushed to my daughter's side. Emily! I screamed, my voice raw with fear. I fell to my knees beside her, my hands shaking as I gently touched her shoulder. She was still breathing, but her face was pale, her eyes fluttering as if she was trying to stay conscious. Blood soaked through her clothes, and my heart shattered. Karen stood there, staring down at us, her face a mask of disbelief. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected things to go this far, but she had made her choice, and it was a choice she would regret for the rest of her life. The world seemed to spin around me as I knelt beside my daughter, my hands trembling as I tried to stem the flow of blood. The sound of the gunshot still echoed in my ears, but it was drowned out by the frantic rush of my heartbeat. Everything else, the laughter of children, the chatter of parents, faded into nothingness. The only thing I could focus on was Emily, lying there motionless, her face pale, her eyes barely open. Emily, baby, please stay with me, I whispered through the tears welling up in my eyes. I gently lifted her head into my lap, her body limp in my arms. The warmth of her blood soaked through my shirt, a brutal reminder of how quickly everything had gone from peaceful to violent. My mind screamed with disbelief, but my instincts kicked in. I had to save her. I had to get her help, and fast. Someone call 911. I screamed, my voice frantic, but no one moved. No one reacted. It was as if the entire world had frozen, as if they couldn't comprehend what was happening. Karen, the woman who had just shot my daughter, stood there, staring at us, her expression unreadable. She wasn't rushing to help. She wasn't even showing remorse. She was standing there as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just changed our lives forever. I looked up at her in disbelief, my eyes wild with rage and terror. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I shouted, but she didn't answer. She just stood there, her cold eyes locked onto mine. In that moment, I realized she wasn't the same woman I had seen around the neighborhood. She wasn't the overly strict HOA president who had barked orders about lawn care and trash cans. No, this was someone different, someone much darker. But I couldn't focus on her. I had to focus on Emily. I heard footsteps behind me, and finally, a few other parents rushed over. "What happened?" One of them asked, his voice filled with disbelief. But there was no time to explain. No time to go over the details. Every second felt like an eternity. One of the parents dialed 911, his hands shaking as he spoke into the phone, but I couldn't hear his words. My entire focus was on Emily. Her breathing was shallow, and her face was pale. The blood, so much blood, seemed to come from everywhere, and my heart broke with every passing second. "Please, baby, stay with me," I whispered over and over again, my voice cracking. I didn't know if she could hear me, but I had to believe she could. She had to stay with me. She had to survive this. The sirens were the only sound that finally pierced through the thick fog of panic that surrounded me. I looked up, seeing the flashing lights of the ambulance approaching. I had never been more relieved in my life. But even as the medics rushed to us, I knew that the fight wasn't over. Emily's life wasn't just in their hands. It was in mine, too. The medics moved quickly, working with practiced efficiency. They examined her wounds and immediately began applying pressure to the injury, but I could tell that they were just as worried as I was. The blood loss was too much. They couldn't waste time. "We need to get her to the hospital now," one of the paramedics said, his voice urgent. "Stay with her, ma'am. Don't let her fall asleep. Talk to her." I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. "Emily, please. Please wake up. You're going to be okay. We're going to fix this. Just hold on." The medics loaded her onto the stretcher, and I followed close behind, my legs feeling like they might give out beneath me. As they wheeled Emily toward the ambulance, I heard Karen's voice again. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she said, her tone flat, almost casual. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." I froze. The words hit me like a slap to the face. It wasn't supposed to happen like this? Was she serious? Did she honestly think this was some sort of accident? That a simple warning had led to my daughter being shot? You didn't mean for it to go this far? I turned to face her, my voice rising with anger. "You shot my daughter, Karen. You shot her in cold blood." But Karen just looked at me, her eyes unblinking, as if I were the crazy one. She was in the way. The playground is for children, not people like her. It was the only way. The air around me went still. For a moment, I couldn't even process her words. "The only way?" I repeated, my voice trembling with disbelief. "Are you hearing yourself? You shot my daughter because her wheelchair clashed with your idea of what this playground should be?" Karen didn't respond. She just stared at me, her face cold, emotionless. I could see her calculating her next move, her mind working to justify what she had done. But it didn't matter. Nothing she said would ever make this right. I turned away from her and followed the paramedics to the ambulance. I couldn't look at her anymore. Not after what she had done. The ride to the hospital was a blur. My mind was racing with a million thoughts, but they all led back to the same place. Emily. Was she going to make it? What if I lost her? I felt a hand on my shoulder. One of the medics had come to sit next to me. "You're doing great. She's going to be okay. We're doing everything we can." But those words felt hollow, meaningless. No matter what they said, no matter how hard they tried, it didn't change the fact that my daughter had been shot, that her innocence had been stolen in an instant. And I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. The hospital doors swung open as the ambulance arrived, and they rushed Emily inside, leaving me standing in the waiting area, my heart pounding in my chest. The doctors would work on her. They would do their best to save her. But what about Karen? What about the monster who had put us here? I couldn't let her get away with this. I couldn't just walk away and pretend everything would go back to normal. I had to fight for Emily. I had to make sure that Karen paid for what she had done. But for now, I had to wait. I had to hold on to the hope that Emily would wake up, that she would survive. The rest could come later. The hospital waiting room was sterile, cold, and suffocating. The walls felt as if they were closing in on me, pressing down with the weight of what had happened. Every tick of the clock felt like a slap, each second dragging on for an eternity. I couldn't sit still. I couldn't stop pacing. I was desperate to know what was happening with Emily, but no one was giving me answers. I kept replaying the moment in my mind over and over again. The sound of the gunshot. The way Karen had stood there, cold and unmoving, as my daughter lay bleeding on the ground. The cruelty in her eyes. It was as if I had entered a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. The medics had told me that Emily was stable for now, but stability wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to stop the rage boiling inside of me. It wasn't enough to erase the image of my little girl in a pool of her own blood. I wasn't going to just sit here and wait. I stood up abruptly, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands shaking with anger. "I need to see her," I said to the nurse at the desk. Her eyes were kind, but I could see the concern in them as she glanced at my worn-out face. "I'm sorry, but the doctors are still working on her," she said gently. "I'll let you know as soon as there's any news." I nodded, forcing myself to take a deep breath. But I couldn't just wait. I couldn't sit around while Karen walked free, while she continued to breathe air that she didn't deserve. I had to do something. I had to make sure she paid for what she had done. I walked out of the waiting room, my feet moving on their own accord, carrying me to the nearest payphone. I didn't have much time to waste. I needed a plan, and I needed it fast. I had one number saved in my phone that I knew could help. A lawyer, someone who had handled tough cases before. Someone who could fight against the powerful and the untouchable. Someone who wouldn't back down when things got ugly. I dialed the number with shaking hands. My heart was still in my throat, but I forced myself to focus. I had to get Emily justice, no matter what. The phone rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Hello, this is David Myers." "David," I said, my voice tight with emotion, It's me, Mark. I need your help. My daughter, she's in the hospital. She's been shot, and it's all because of Karen, the HOA president. You know her, right? She shot my daughter, David. She just shot her point blank, in front of me. And now she's in there fighting for her life, and I'm not sure how much longer I can keep it together. I need your help. I need to make sure she doesn't get away with this." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could hear David's breath, steady but concerned, as he processed what I had just said. "I'm on my way," he said after a moment. "Give me the details, and I'll make sure she doesn't walk away from this." I felt a rush of relief. Someone was going to fight for my daughter. Someone was going to hold Karen accountable. "I'll meet you at the hospital," I said. "But David, we can't let her get away with this. She needs to pay for what she's done." "I promise you, Mark," David replied, his voice firm, "she will." I hung up the phone and stood there for a moment, staring into the empty street. My hands were still trembling, but my mind was clearer now. I wasn't just a father trying to save his daughter. I was a man determined to get justice for her. I wasn't going to sit by and let Karen's cruelty go unpunished. When I walked back into the hospital, it felt different. The air was still thick with fear, but I was no longer paralyzed by it. I had a purpose. I wasn't going to just let Emily's suffering fade into the background. I wasn't going to let Karen's actions be swept under the rug like they were nothing. David arrived ashort, while later, a tall man with short-cropped hair and a stern expression. His eyes softened when he saw me, but there was no time for pleasantries. I needed answers. "We're going to file charges," David said without hesitation after I told him everything that had happened. "But it's going to take more than just a statement. We need evidence. We need witnesses, security footage, everything we can get. This isn't just a simple assault, Mark. She shot your daughter, and we're going to make sure the world knows what kind of person Karen is." I nodded, feeling a sense of empowerment that I hadn't felt before. I had the tools now. I had someone who knew how to navigate the system, who wasn't afraid to take on the big players. And for the first time, I could see a way out of this dark hole Karen had thrown us into. But as much as I wanted to believe that this was enough, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. Karen wasn't just some random woman on the street. She was the president of the HOA, a woman who had the power to make life miserable for anyone who crossed her. She had resources. She had connections. And she wasn't going to go down without a fight. But I wasn't afraid. I wasn't afraid of her anymore. I wasn't afraid of the system or the people who would try to protect her. My daughter's life was worth more than any political or social connection she had. Karen had crossed a line, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. "We're going to fight this all the way," David said, as if reading my mind. "And we're going to win." I nodded again, my resolve strengthening. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The fight to get justice for Emily wasn't just a legal battle. It was a battle for everything we had left, our dignity, our sense of safety, and our right to live without fear of people like Karen. As I sat down beside Emily's bed, holding her small hand, I made a silent promise to her. I would make sure Karen paid for what she had done, no matter what it took. The courtroom was a tense and silent battlefield, the air thick with anticipation. Every eye in the room was fixed on the proceedings, and I could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on me. My pulse quickened as I looked at the judge, who was reviewing the papers in front of him with a stern expression. This was it. The moment I had been dreading, the moment I had been working toward, was finally here. I could barely focus on the people around me. The lawyers, the witnesses, the family members who had gathered, everything felt like a blur. All I could think about was Emily. What would she say if she could see me now? What would she want me to do? I stood beside David, my lawyer, as we waited for the trial to begin. Karen sat across from us, her icy stare cutting through the room like a knife. She was dressed in a tailored black suit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, looking as poised and confident as ever. But underneath all that, I could see the nervous energy radiating from her. She was trying so hard to maintain control, but I knew the truth. She was scared. Scared because she knew what she had done. She knew the gravity of her actions, and no matter how much she tried to hide it, I could see the cracks in her facade. The judge called the court to order, and the room fell into a dead silence. The sound of his gavel striking the wood reverberated through my chest, a loud reminder that this was real. This was happening. We're here today to address the charge of assault with a deadly weapon, resulting in serious injury. The judge announced, his voice clear and steady. He glanced over at Karen, who straightened in her seat. The defendant, Karen Harlow, is accused of shooting the plaintiff's daughter, Emily Turner, in a public space. Ms. Harlow, how do you plead? Karen's lips pressed together in a thin line before she spoke. Not guilty, Your Honor, she said coolly, her voice unwavering. I did not intend to harm the child. This was an unfortunate incident, a misunderstanding. A wave of disbelief washed over me. Did she really just say that? Did she truly expect anyone to believe her? A misunderstanding. She had pulled out a gun and shot my daughter, and she was trying to play it off as an accident? David squeezed my shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. Stay calm, he whispered, his voice steady. This is just the beginning. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The moment I had feared, facing Karen in a courtroom, had arrived, but I was no longer paralyzed by fear. I had come this far, and I wasn't going to let her manipulate the truth. David stood up and addressed the court, his voice strong and confident. Your Honor, what we are dealing with here is not a simple misunderstanding. What we are dealing with is a deliberate and premeditated act of violence. Karen Harlow shot a defenseless child, my client's daughter, in cold blood. And for what? Because the child was in a wheelchair? Because she didn't fit into Ms. Harlow's narrow view of what's acceptable in this neighborhood? That is not an accident. That is a crime. I watched as Karen shifted in her seat, her face tightening. Her earlier calm demeanor began to crack, revealing the anxiety beneath. But I wasn't going to let her off the hook that easily. I wasn't going to let her manipulate the situation. David's voice grew stronger as he continued. This was not a case of self-defense. This was not a moment of panic. This was a woman who made a choice to take out a gun and fire it at a child. And now my client's daughter, Emily, is lying in a hospital bed, fighting for her life. This was an act of aggression, and it has scarred my client and his family in ways that cannot be undone. I could see the jurors exchanging glances, the impact of David's words settling in. They had to understand the weight of what had happened. They had to see Karen for who she truly was. Karen's lawyer stood up, interrupting the proceedings. Objection, Your Honor. The defense maintains that Ms. Harlow acted in the heat of the moment, and there was no intent to harm. The judge nodded but looked at the defense attorney with a raised eyebrow. I will allow the defense to present their case, but I remind everyone that we are here to establish the facts. David motioned for me to take the stand. It was my turn. I felt my legs shaking as I made my way to the witness stand, my heart pounding in my chest. This was the moment I had been dreading, the moment where I would have to relive the horror of that day. But I couldn't back down. I had to speak up. I had to make sure Emily's voice was heard. As I sat down, I looked at Karen. Her gaze was cold, but I didn't flinch. I was ready. Mr. Turner, the judge said, his voice gentle, please tell the court what happened on the day of the incident. I closed my eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady myself. The memories flooded back. In an instant, the laughter of the children, the sharp sound of Karen's voice, the terror that followed when I saw my daughter lying on the ground. I remember everything, I said, my voice steady despite the emotion building inside me. It was just another day at the playground. My daughter, Emily, was playing with her friends. She was happy. She had every right to be there. But then Karen came over. She started yelling at us, telling us we didn't belong. And before I knew it, she pulled out a gun and shot my daughter. My baby, right in front of me. I paused, fighting back the tears. I tried to protect her. I tried to get to her. But it was too late. The damage was done. And now my daughter is fighting for her life. And Karen, she just walked away like nothing happened. I looked at the jury, my eyes locking with each one. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. Karen made a choice, and that choice changed our lives forever. The room was silent as I finished, the weight of my words hanging in the air. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on me, but I didn't look away. I couldn't. Not now. The judge nodded, his expression unreadable, and Karen's lawyer remained silent. But I could see it in their eyes. The doubt that had once been there was starting to fade. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The courtroom erupted into murmurs as I stepped down from the witness stand, my heart still racing. But something had shifted. Karen was no longer the untouchable woman she thought she was. She was just a person sitting in a courtroom, facing the consequences of her actions. The trial had barely begun, and yet the impact of what had happened was already rippling through the neighborhood, through the community. The tension that had settled in the courtroom was only a reflection of the storm brewing outside. Karen had underestimated what would come from her actions. She thought she could intimidate us, silence us with her power, but the truth had found its way to the surface. And now, it was impossible to ignore. I remember the day after I testified, walking back into the house after the trial. Emily was still in the hospital, still fighting to hold on. The doctors were hopeful, but there was no telling how this would change her, how this would change all of us. But as I walked through the door, my phone buzzed. It was a text from a neighbor. Karen's in deep. I don't know how she's going to recover from this. It was the first time I realized the ripple effect of the trial. It wasn't just a case about one woman shooting my daughter. It wasn't just about Emily's blood spilled on that playground. It was about the entire community seeing Karen for who she really was. And the more the trial continued, the more people began to talk. the more they started to see her for what she had done. But the fallout wasn't just about Karen. It was about what it meant for the rest of us. We were no longer just a family living in a neighborhood. We were the ones who had dared to stand up to fight back against the power of someone like Karen. And with that came consequences. Neighbors who had once waved politely when I passed by started avoiding me. The whispers in the streets grew louder. Karen's influence hadn't disappeared overnight. She had connections, and she wasn't going to let them go easily. She had made sure to plant seeds of doubt, convincing people that the story I was telling was fabricated, that I was just a father seeking revenge, that my daughter was somehow responsible for her own shooting. But the community had begun to turn. More and more people started to reach out to us in private, parents, workers, even some of the neighbors who had been too afraid to speak before. They knew the truth. They couldn't hide from it any longer. One afternoon, I received a call from a local news station. They wanted to do an interview. They wanted to get my side of the story, to shed light on what had happened. The press had caught wind of Karen's criminal history, the numerous complaints about her overreach as HOA president. There was no turning back for her. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sure if I wanted the world to know about the chaos in our lives, about the horrible things that had happened to Emily and me. But then I realized something. It wasn't just about us. It wasn't just about getting Karen arrested. It was about making sure that no one else would have to endure what we had been through. It was about speaking out against the kind of person who thought they could get away with anything. The interview was set up for the following day. The studio was a blur of bright lights, cameras, and microphones. I was still so tired, physically, emotionally, mentally, but I knew this was part of the fight. As I sat in front of the camera, I looked at the interviewer, a kind-faced woman who seemed genuinely concerned about Emily's condition. I took a deep breath and started to speak. It's hard to describe what it's like to watch your daughter lie in a hospital bed, fighting for her life because of someone else's hate. I began, my voice cracking. But that's what we're dealing with here. Karen shot my daughter in cold blood because she didn't think Emily fit into her idea of what a proper playground should look like. And now we're here, fighting for justice, fighting for what's right. I paused, feeling the weight of every word. I know people are scared of Karen. She's a bully. She's made sure everyone who crosses her suffers. But we can't live in fear anymore. We have to fight back. If we don't, people like her will keep thinking they can do whatever they want. When the interview aired, I was blown away by the response. The city was buzzing. People came forward, telling their own stories of harassment from Karen and her HOA. They had seen the way she bullied families, the way she used her position to manipulate others. No one had spoken up before, too afraid to lose their homes or their peace, but now they were ready to fight back. The pressure on Karen intensified. The media coverage was relentless, and soon, news outlets from all over the country were covering the case. The story of a mother and father who would stop at nothing to get justice for their daughter was now a national story. Emily's name was becoming synonymous with the fight for the rights of disabled children, for the fight against injustice. It was painful, but it was also empowering. At the same time, the pressure on Karen was mounting. Her lawyer tried to keep her image intact, to spin the narrative in her favor. But it was clear that the truth had caught up with her. The court of public opinion had already made its decision. She was a criminal, and the walls she had built around her were beginning to crumble. Then came the bombshell. A former neighbor came forward with a hidden recording, audio from a meeting where Karen had openly mocked the idea of disabled children being allowed in the community playground. The recording was damning. It was clear evidence that Karen had not only shot Emily out of anger, but had a long-standing disdain for people who didn't fit into her narrow, exclusionary view of the world. The recording was released to the public, and the fallout from it was catastrophic. Public outrage exploded. People who had previously stayed silent were now taking action, signing petitions, and demanding that Karen be held accountable not just for the shooting, but for her years of abuse as HOA president. And still, Karen remained defiant. She refused to take responsibility. She maintained her innocence, claiming that everything she did was in self-defense, that she had no choice. But with each passing day, the walls around her collapsed further. But the worst was yet to come. It had been weeks since the trial began, but the weight of the entire ordeal felt like it had dragged on for months. The fight for justice was no longer just about Emily, it was about every single person who had been silenced by Karen, every family who had been bullied by her, and every child who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. It was bigger than us. It was bigger than her. The final court date arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Karen had become a symbol of everything corrupt, everything that was wrong with the system. She had lied. She had manipulated. And now it was time for the truth to prevail. As I sat beside David, I couldn't help but glance over at Karen. She had never looked more defeated. Gone was the confident, poised woman who had held power over our community. Now, she was just a woman sitting at a table, clinging to her lies, hoping the judge would believe her. But she was running out of options. David leaned in close. "This is it. We've got her." I nodded, but there was still a knot in my stomach. I couldn't shake the fear that maybe, just maybe, she'd find a way to wriggle out of this. But as the prosecutor stood up to present the final arguments, something shifted inside me. I had seen enough. I had been through too much to let her get away with this. The prosecutor stood tall, his voice firm, as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, we have presented more than enough evidence to convict the defendant. We have the witnesses, we have the recordings, and we have the facts." Karen Harlow shot Emily Turner, a defenseless child, in cold blood, and there is no defense for her actions. We ask for a guilty verdict. It was like a weight had been lifted. The truth had been laid bare. There was no more spinning the narrative, no more hiding behind lies. The truth was undeniable. Karen had to face the consequences. The judge didn't waste any time. He didn't linger, didn't let the drama drag on any longer than it needed to. He turned to Karen, who was sitting rigidly in her seat, trying to maintain whatever semblance of control she had left. "Karen Harlow, I find you guilty of assault with a deadly weapon, resulting in grievous bodily injury," the judge said, his voice clear and resolute. I heard a gasp from the gallery. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind couldn't process it. It was real. It was happening. Karen was going to pay for what she did. The judge continued, "You will be sentenced to serve prison time, and restitution will be made to the victim's family. This court will make sure justice is served." I couldn't hold it in any more. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since that day in the playground, I felt like I could breathe again. It wasn't just a victory for us, it was a victory for every family who had ever been bullied, for every child who had ever felt unsafe. It was a victory for justice. I looked over at Karen, who was now pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. She couldn't believe it. She couldn't believe that everything she had fought so hard to protect, the power, the control, had crumbled before her eyes. But it was too late for her. The truth had caught up, and there was no escaping it now. As we left the courtroom, I felt a sense of peace settling over me. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. We had lost too much. Emily would never be the same. But we had won. We had stood up for what was right, and in the end, that made all the difference. The following days were a blur. Emily's recovery was slow, but she was strong. We were surrounded by the support of friends, neighbors, and strangers who had heard our story and rallied behind us. The community that had once been fractured by Karen's power was starting to come together. People began to speak out, to share their own stories of how Karen had tormented them. And slowly, the shadow she had cast over our neighborhood began to lift. But the true victory was in seeing Emily smile again. It wasn't the same as before. The sparkle in her eyes was still clouded by what had happened. But she was fighting. She was pushing through, and that made me prouder than I had ever been in my life. We went home from the hospital after weeks of treatment, and every time I looked at Emily, I saw the strength in her. She was more than a victim of violence. She was a survivor, and that, more than anything, was what I had to hold on to. As for Karen, she faced her sentencing. The prison time she received wasn't enough to undo the harm she had caused, but it was a step in the right direction. Justice had been served, and I could finally breathe again, knowing that Emily could begin to heal, knowing that I had done everything I could to protect her. But there was still something I couldn't shake. The moment I looked at Karen in that courtroom, I realized that this wasn't just about punishing her for what she did to my daughter. It was about sending a message to everyone who thought they could get away with cruelty. It was about saying loud and clear that we wouldn't stand for it. The world was full of people like Karen, people who thought their power meant they could control others, people who thought they could make decisions about who belonged and who didn't. But this was our world, too, and we were not going to let them get away with it. I looked at Emily, who was now playing in the backyard with her friends, a soft smile on her face. "You did it, baby," I whispered to myself. "You did it." And with that, the long battle was finally over. But I knew that the fight for what was right would never end. As I sit here, reflecting on everything that's happened, I realize that what we've gone through isn't just our story. It's the story of countless families out there who have been pushed around, silenced, and made to feel like they don't belong. It's the story of anyone who has ever been wronged and felt powerless in the face of injustice. But today, we've proven that no matter how small or powerless we might feel, we have the power to fight back. We have the power to stand up for what's right. And this is where you come in. If you're watching this and you've ever felt like you were pushed aside, like you didn't matter, I want you to know, you do matter. You have a voice. You have the right to stand up for yourself and those you love. Don't let anyone ever make you feel like you don't belong. You are just as important as anyone else. So, I'm asking you today to do two things. Stand up for what's right. If you see someone being wronged, if you witness injustice, speak up. Don't be silent. Your voice matters. Your actions matter. Together, we can make the world a better place one person at a time. Support those who need it. Share this story with others. Encourage those who feel silenced to speak out. Let's create a community where everyone feels safe, valued, and heard. The more we come together, the stronger we'll be. If you're watching this and you want to help keep this conversation going, hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Let's spread the message far and wide that justice is possible, and that standing up for what's right isn't just a choice, it's a responsibility. And for Emily, and for every child out there who deserves a world free of hate and cruelty, this fight is for you. Thank you for being here, for standing with us, and for being part of this journey. Together, we're stronger.